I am Tammy Bruce. Welcome to the Tucker Carlson Show. Tucker Carlson tonight. I'm filling in for Tucker this evening. No matter who President Trump picked for the Supreme Court, the left was going to go berserk. The Women's March even sent out a statement declaring their opposition to the president's nomination of XX to the Supreme Court. As soon as Judge Brett Kavanaugh's nomination was announced last night, the floodgates of outrage opened. Politicians gathered with protesters on the steps of the Supreme Court, competing to see who could be the most upset.
Hey, ho, Kavanaugh has got to go!
To say no to this justice, to say no to unbalancing the Supreme Court, and to say yes to liberty and justice. Are you ready to defend Roe versus Wade?
What is at stake is women's freedom. Our freedom to make our own decisions. Our freedom to decide when and how many children we are going to have.
Wow. Meanwhile, actor Rob Reiner tweeted, quote, "It's official. Trump, who is now under investigation for obstruction of justice and conspiring with an enemy to destroy democracy, has selected the judges who could rule on whether he can be forced to testify, be indicted, or pardon himself. Autocracy, here we come. Vote." John Daniel Davidson is a senior correspondent at The Federalist. He joins us now. John, welcome to the program. I appreciate you joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you know, I'm sure we've all seen a lot of this outrage regularly. It's not necessarily a surprise, but being at The Federalist, and you're I guess you're supposed to be evil. I'm wondering, on that list that you've helped create for the president with judicial nominees, if like Godzilla and maybe Mothra are on that list. I mean, the hysteria we're seeing over this is pretty astounding. Knowing the quality of all the judges that you've put on that list for the president, including, of course, Judge Gorsuch, that you've consulted with, and now Judge Kavanaugh. What is your take on the nature of the reaction that we've been seeing to it?
Well, I think there's a canned quality to the outrage that we saw Monday night, and you saw that with all the preparations beforehand. These people were going to protest the nominee, doesn't matter who it is. And the reason for that is they don't have a problem with Judge Kavanaugh, who has impeccable credentials, and no one would seriously argue that he's not qualified for the job. They have a problem with the Constitution. These are people on the left, Democratic leadership in the Senate, don't want an originalist. They don't want someone who will rule strictly according to what the law says. They want judges that will legislate from the bench and that will read new rights into the Constitution, as they have been doing for the past 40 years. So the nominee is not the issue here. It's the Constitution.
You know, there's an irony to this, because they keep saying that President Trump and his administration are conservatives, are all fascist, and yet they're the ones who are nervous at the notion of a judicial nominee and judges who literally just take the Constitution seriously, right? That's the thing that upsets them. And that should send a warning signal to everyone across the board. Obviously, we're all able to enjoy our lives because of the nature of our founders, because of the Constitution. And that's all that, if you want to call it conservative, I call it American. But that's all we really want from these judges, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. But that's not what the left wants. The left wants an ever-increasing welfare state, an ever-increasing government apparatus that can control the lives of Americans and force people to do things that they want people to do, from Obamacare to, the contraceptive mandates, to forcing people to join labor unions. That's what the left would like to do, and the Constitution gets in their way. So that's their real complaint here, and the nominee is just a pretext.
Yeah, it always has been, and we'll see how this turns out. I think President Trump has done a very good job, and the American people are already seeing the benefit of a conservative point of view when it comes to policy. John, thanks for joining us tonight. I appreciate it. Now, there is another point of view that is going to come forward here with Richard Goodstein. Richard is an attorney and has advised both of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaigns. He joins us now. So I guess are you pretty happy with the response to Judge Kavanaugh, I take it? Is that right?
Tammy,
you think it's appropriate?
Brett Kavanaugh is a very smart guy. Is a lovely family. That story he told last night was very moving. But the woman who's going to go to a back room rather than to a doctor for an abortion, the gay person who can't marry the person that they love, the person who has a pre-existing condition is scared to death because they won't be able to afford health insurance. They don't really care how nice a guy Brett Kavanaugh is. They are definitely concerned. You know, you could call it a meltdown on the left. This is people's lives. This is, you know, you're talking about criminalization. That's what Donald Trump talked about on the campaign trail of of a woman seeking an abortion. So this is a meltdown only insofar as this is destructive to people's lives.
See,
so
Richard, this is what's interesting. This is what's interesting. You admit he's a nice guy, and yet you describe somebody who sounds pretty mean and evil, that just wanting to focus on destroying. Look, my activism on the left started with abortion rights. I'm a gay woman. And I have an interest, and I love this country, and I found that it's the conservative ideal that reinforces personal freedom. But to say that already we know Judge Kavanaugh has said that he has no interest in overturning Roe versus Wade. You're repeating this notion that people are going to die because of this dynamic. We've been hearing that for decades now whenever a Republican appoints a Supreme Court justice, and it hasn't happened, has it?
Well, the reason it hasn't, because Anthony Kennedy for decades has been on the Supreme Court, right? And if we have somebody, Tammy, let me ask you now, how much money would how much money would you be prepared to put down this minute that when there is a decision coming out of this Supreme Court with Kavanaugh as a member, that they're going to come out and reaffirm Roe versus Wade? I think the odds of that are quite slim. So all I'm saying is,
but see, this is. What's interesting is we have his history. We have his statements about what he intends. So at this point, I think what we've seen for decades now are liberals, the Democratic Party, and I remember I used it when I was with the National Organization for Women. Yeah. It raises money. It gets people out to vote. It's about existential threats. Whereas, in fact, the question becomes, Richard, why aren't things really secure at this point? After 8 years of Barack Obama, why is the argument by liberals that everything in a moment, that the ceiling is going to come down, that the sky is going to fall? Well, shouldn't we be actually having better conversations in the 21st century at this point with all the work we've done?
You know, there were several 5-4 decisions that upheld rights, gay rights, rights to abortion and so forth, when Justice Kennedy was that swing vote. You know that as well as anybody. And the fact is he's going to be replaced by somebody. Look, Tammy, I hope nobody in your audience, and you included, don't take seriously what he said when he was up for confirmation to the Court of Appeals. He was bound by Supreme Court precedent. When he's a justice, he's not.
So you're asking us to not take him seriously, but to take you seriously, that people are going to die because of this appointment. Americans are tired of it being spun around like this because of the drama of people wanting to win elections. We want good policy. We know that Kennedy, right? I mean, the argument against him was the same, and yet now he's the swing vote. So when we're looking at this, we've got always generally balanced decisions. We've got examples when you're following the Constitution. That's the other question. If you're a constitutionalist, what is everyone on the left so afraid of with someone who is going to follow the Constitution in a strict manner?
The fact of the matter is, being a strict constitutionalist means having a result that comports with your point of view. Let's not have this idea be taken seriously, because the fact is, to the gay person who wants to marry somebody that they love, to them, that was a right that they had under liberty and the pursuit of happiness.
All right? And
that
Richard,
was something that's there.
With a Supreme Court with both liberals and conservatives, the nation has found its way on that issue and will continue to do so. Richard, thanks for joining us tonight. Well, I think we can pretty much guarantee that with the direction of the country now. We've seen what the conservative ideal really means. Now, for analysis of Trump's pick and the coming confirmation battle, we are joined by Fox senior political analyst Brit Hume. Mr. Hume, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Hi, Tammy.
Yeah, look, obviously the conversation is filled with politics. It's the drama. It's angst. It's another Armageddon. What's your take on this remarkable reaction to a pretty good pick, I think?
It is a remarkable. It is about what I anticipated because of the fear that the court's balance would be upset by this choice. But let's just look at a couple of issues. Let's look at Roe versus Wade. If Roe versus Wade were reversed, it would not mean that abortion would become illegal across this country. Exactly. It would simply mean that it would not be guaranteed as a constitutional right. It would then be up to the legislatures in the 50 states to decide whether abortion in their states should be legal or not. I wouldn't think that that everyone would have to fear that all the legislators across the country, or even very many of them, would decide that abortion should be illegal. And if they did, it would be the democratic processes deciding the issue. What are they afraid of? They're afraid because some of these rights, the right to gay marriage, the right to an abortion, and other rights as well, have been basically created by the courts. They have found them lurking in the Constitution, previously unnoticed, and established them as law. And the fact is, if these rights were to fall by the wayside as constitutional rights, it would then be up to the democratic processes to either accept them, reestablish them, or not. So it seems to me that the idea that people are going to die because of this, that abortion will become illegal everywhere, is hysterical and overstated for the purpose of defeating this nominee.
And isn't it, I think, a good argument as well that when you are reliant on the courts, which is what the left seems to want to do with the Supreme Court, you are at risk if there is a change in power. Whereas if you actually have the population, when you go through the democratic process and the American people say in a uniform way, yes, let's move in this direction, let's do this, whether it's about abortion or if it's about gay rights, no matter where you stand on that issue, that's the security of what I think the founders wanted, is the American people coming together and deciding who we were going to become and what we wanted. But creating law through, of course, the court, or in this framework, is always going to be much more fragile.
Exactly. Make no mistake about it, though, Tammy. I mean, the Republican majority is a bare majority now, and campaigns against a particular nominee may find some force in a particular state where a critical senator may reside, and these things can have an effect and can turn the tide. I've seen it happen before. It may be unfair, it may be unreasonable, it may be grossly overstated, but make no mistake about it, this kind of thing can work, and the defenders of this nominee are going to have to be on their toes to combat this sort of stuff, as extreme as it may sound to our ears as we sit here tonight.
Well, and Chuck Schumer said he's going to do everything possible to stop this nominee. It seems somewhat unlikely, but of course this seems to be a level of kind of mass hysteria and almost a kind of a dynamic of fear that the left want to impart upon people in elected office, office holders in general, threats against families we've seen in certain cases. This is the kind of thing that makes a difference. Does Judge Kavanaugh's choice, it seems to eliminate Murkowski and Collins from being problems, from voting against. Do you see that being the case?
I would just say, in this, so if you're backing this judge, I'd say so far so good with them. Susan Collins has said that she thought he was, a well qualified, experienced judge, but she's withholding judgment, as I think she properly should, right, as is Lisa Murkowski. So, look, these hearings are a tightrope walk. Lots of things can happen. He has a voluminous record, as has been pointed out. People may be able to find things and seize upon them. Look, in 1987, Robert Bork was an exceedingly well-qualified nominee, and there was a campaign to portray him because he did not believe that there existed in the Constitution an all-purpose right to privacy. In fact, such a right does actually not exist. It was discovered and basically invented by the court back in the 1960s. He disagreed with that concept, and he was successfully tarred as anti-privacy. And it worked, and he was defeated. So these kinds of things can happen, and they're throwing a lot of balls up in the air and up against the wall now to see what might work, and we'll see. Terry McAuliffe was saying last night that the Kavanaugh nomination threatens the lives of millions of Americans.
Remarkable.
Now, that's, on the face of it, seemingly preposterous. But you got to watch out for this stuff. Sometimes it works. That's a very good point. Excellent advice. Thank you, Sir Britt. Thanks for joining us tonight. You bet. Thank you, Tammy. We'll continue our coverage of the Kavanaugh nomination throughout the night. Absolutely. We're also going to talk to a former clerk and former law student of his as well. Now, as there's also a New York City councilman coming up who was arrested last night protesting the nomination. Take a look at this. But up next, President Trump is headed to the UK, and the U.S. Embassy says Americans in London should watch out for their safety. What is going on in Britain? That's just ahead.
So I have NATO, I have the UK, which is in somewhat turmoil, and I have Putin. Frankly, Putin may be the easiest of them all. Who would think? Who would think?
All righty, that was obviously President Trump today as he headed off to Europe for tomorrow's NATO summit in Brussels. Early next week, he'll be in Helsinki for a meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And between those two meetings, he'll be in the UK for a state visit. But all is not well in advance of that visit. The U.S. Embassy, strangely enough, is having to warn Americans in London to keep a low profile during the president's visit, in case anti-Trump protests become violent. Niall Gardner is the director of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. He joins us now. And what a fabulous thing to be ahead of, Niall. Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, it's, Margaret Thatcher, of course, her history reminds us of the importance of England, the importance of the British people, obviously, our family. Really, what is going on there? We know Prime Minister May is in trouble, but why are Americans having to be warned in London, of all places? Can you give us some background here and what to expect?
Yeah, I think firstly, this is a fairly sort of routine warning that the U.S. Embassy gives here in London with regard to potential large-scale protests. We've seen these warnings given actually for previous visits by U.S. presidents, in particular the visit by George W. Bush. But having said that, it is it is sad, of course, that you are going to see some large-scale protests on the streets of London. Some of those protests could potentially be violent. And certainly, I think, left-wing groups from Britain and all over Europe certainly will be trying to mobilize and disrupt this visit. They won't succeed in doing so, but they will cause a lot of traffic disruption. And certainly the authorities here are on full alert to try and prevent any outbreaks of violence on the streets of London, but there are many on the left who would like to see violence here.
Well, look, we know, of course, not just through Prime Minister Thatcher's job as well. I mean, she was always under attack. And we know that the left is all throughout Europe. Certainly, they've made some inroads, certainly in England. But the president must have some friends there. We know you're friends with him. Where is the support base for the president there? What does it look like right now?
Yeah, so there are a lot of supporters of President Trump here in the United Kingdom, especially Brexit supporters. President Trump is a very strong backer of Brexit. He's a believer in sovereignty and self-determination. He's been one of the biggest supporters on the world stage of Britain's exit from the European Union. So there's a lot of support for President Trump from Brexit backers, among MPs here in Parliament, among Conservative MPs who are Brexit supporters, but also among the general public. Those who support Brexit, I think, see in President Trump a strong supporter of Britain leaving the European Union. Also, President Trump is a very strong advocate for the US-UK special relationship.
Right.
He's a great admirer of Britain. He loves Great Britain. And I think there are many people here in Great Britain who strongly believe in the special relationship and who believe the president's visit is very important.
Niall, I think one of my arguments has been that the media has been, I think, misleading us about the depth of the supposed division between Americans or in England, that in fact, perhaps there's a lot more support. We've seen it certainly sweep through Europe, this desire for genuine freedom, for self-determination, for an end to the left controlling our lives and destroying it. That is, of course, a genuine human desire. And I think the media is misrepresenting things in this regard. So when it comes to the alliance in general, your prime minister is in some trouble. We've seen, of course, issues regarding that, and Boris Johnson. Where does the alliance politically stand for him at this point?
Right. So firstly, I would say that the Anglo-American special relationship is very, very strong. The ties between London and Washington are extremely
We think this will make it stronger. Do you expect this trip also to make it stronger? I mean, he really does make an impact when he visits.
Absolutely, it will strengthen the special relationship. And I think certainly President Trump will be bringing with him a very bold, optimistic vision for Brexit. And he'll be encouraging Britain to basically handle the negotiations with the European Union with strength, resolve and conviction. So I do think the advice that he'll be giving to the British government will be very, very important advice, the right advice. After all, this is a British government in some turmoil. We've seen the resignation of 2 cabinet ministers over the last few days. And certainly I think that President Trump's message here in London will be a vitally important message at this time.
And people will be surprised. They will be very charmed. They will realize he's a serious man. And I think that's going to make a huge difference for him and for us. Now, thank you so much for joining us and for that perspective.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Great job. Peter Strzok and Lisa Page are scheduled to testify on Capitol Hill in the next 2 days. Not that we've had a busy week, right? What might they say, and what should lawmakers be looking for? That's coming up next. Disgraced FBI agents Peter Strzok and Lisa Page are scheduled to testify to Congress this week. Page is supposed to testify behind closed doors tomorrow, though there are reports that her testimony apparently has not been finalized. Now, on Thursday, Peter Strzok is going to publicly testify to both the House Judiciary and Oversight Committees. So what might those House members and the country learn from that testimony? Well, we've got the woman who will likely have the answer. Kim Strassel is on the Wall Street Journal editorial board. She joins us now, and Kim, it's a pleasure to talk with you. Whenever you come up, and for my radio audience and on social media, we so like hearing a smart point of view, an investigative framework, and thank you for joining us tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Now, look, there's a lot coming up, obviously. We all know their names, but the fact of the matter is Peter Strzok is key because he was leading both, ironically and strangely, the Hillary and Trump investigations. This is the man, of course, who pledged to his girlfriend, Lisa, that they were going to stop Trump. So we're seeing a framework here that while it seems like it's two people, the big issue is how far does this go? Is this a larger framework? Why was he so comfortable being so brazenly against Trump? And how is it that he heads these particular teams up? What do you think we can expect from his testimony? And will we get any of those answers?
Well, this testimony is going to be key. It's arguably probably the most important testimony we will have had yet. And the reason why, as you said, he was lead investigator for both of those probes. And that's important because if we're to take former FBI Director Jim Comey at his word, he wasn't really involved with the day-to-day. So Peter Strzok is the guy who was making the hands-on decisions out there. Amazing. And I think just as important, there's going to be a lot of questions for him. It'll be interesting to see what he says, but also to see what he does not say.
Right.
I would expect very much for him at times to say that he can't go into it, ongoing investigation, classified information. We'll see how much tolerance the members have for that. But just as interesting will be if he pleads the fifth, and if he does, in relation to what questions, because that would suggest his legal counsel has advised him that he might have a professional or legal liability in some regard.
And he had he did some private testimony, a private interview, and didn't he have a number of FBI attorneys with him? I mean, he's moving through this framework, clearly, it seems, with the support or protection of an entity, some might call it the swamp or otherwise, and clearly they're being the position they're in, they're schooled in knowing how to not answer. Is this what we can expect? Do you think it would be a slip up, or how do we get information from people who simply don't want to give it to us?
Well, this is highly concerning because it does seem to be that the FBI is sitting there right next to him, nudging him to make sure that he doesn't say anything they don't want him to say. But look, this is going to be different in public testimony. He's not going to have that entire phalanx around him. And he's going to have a lot of congressmen that have the opportunity to ask probing and continuing questions, not just on some of the framework we already know about. Like, for instance, why did the FBI really believe it was credible to launch an entire counterintelligence investigation, which is a very big deal, on the basis of some hearsay from an Australian politician about a third-ranking Trump aide who made a comment in a London bar?
Right.
How much did he know about the dossier? Did he have interactions with the dossier's author, Christopher Steele? There's going to be a lot of places they can go. How does he explain his bias? But also, we're going to get an opportunity to ask him some questions about stuff we don't know about. Did they really only begin this investigation at the end of July, or were they running informants before that point? And if so, on what basis? And also a lot of information and questions about the Hillary Clinton probe, too, which remain unanswered.
Should he be worried, and I know that her testimony will be in private, but should he be worried about Lisa Page's testimony and what she's going to say? Obviously, when you've got two individuals, it can be important to be able to play one against the other, that it could be reasonable to consider that, considering her position was somewhat different than his. Do you think she's going to become a liability or become a problem for him? And is that what perhaps some of the investigators are looking for?
I think all of the upcoming testimony is potentially problematic for each other, because if you think about it, step back, they've had some of the main guys come in and testify, but it was a deliberate decision by many of the committees to not have some of these central players, the absolute key witnesses, come in until they had had a chance to go over all the documents and obtain everything they wanted. That's a basic investigative technique. You want to know what questions you need to ask them because you might only get one shot or two. Wow. And so they've got a raft of witnesses now. Devin Nunes at the Intelligence Committee has sent over a list of dozens of names. Yeah. And these people are central figures, FBI, State Department, and Obama administration. Wow. And we'll see just how many of their stories line up.
Yeah, we've got a long way to go, and this story is certainly bigger than what's just in front of us. Kimberly Strassel, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, what kind of person is Brett Kavanaugh? You get this caricature that the left is trying to portray. Well, we're going to find out. One of his clerks joins us next.
Justice Kennedy devoted his career to securing liberty. I am deeply honored to be nominated to fill his seat on the Supreme Court.
Brett Kavanaugh presented a polished, all-American front while speaking last night. But what is the man who aspires to be America's 114th Supreme Court Justice really like? Well, we're going to find out here. Jennifer Mascott is a professor at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason and clerked under Judge Kavanaugh in 2006. J.D. Vance, you know him as well. He is the author of Hillbilly Elegy and was a student of Judge Kavanaugh's at Yale Law School. They both join us now. You know, we've already seen this attempt to, by carnival barkers, if you will, of an attempt to characterize Judge Kavanaugh as something I think that he's not. Jennifer, having clerked with him, and you're a law professor now, we know that lawyers are actually human beings also, and they're complex individuals. What can you tell the audience about this man? They're going to hear a lot about him coming up, but you know him personally. What can you tell us?
Well, he's very approachable, very good-natured. He's an independent, fair-minded judge. USA Today wrote about him yesterday that on paper he may be the most qualified Supreme Court nominee in generations. He's got one of the sharpest legal minds in the country, and from working with him, I can tell you that he approaches every case with an open mind, and if he were to be confirmed to the Supreme Court, I expect he'd keep doing what he's been doing for the past 12 years on the D.C. Circuit.
Well, that's good to hear, and it's not surprising. We hear a uniform understanding about that he's smart, that he's nice. You know, they can't deny those things. JD, also from your experience, I mean, you've got, there's going to be such incredible pressure. These are human stories. It's about the human condition. And you got nice people. He's obviously smart, though. He's been through the ringer a little bit before. How do you expect this process to affect him? And what do you expect once he does get on the Supreme Court, which I fully expect? Do you think that he will continue, once he's in this job, that he can never lose? Do you think his character will continue to shine through in that regard?
No, absolutely. I think the process, I don't expect to really affect him a ton because he's already an incredibly grounded person. You know, he cares about his family. He's got a great relationship with his kids and with his community. He's the sort of person who's going to go through the confirmation process knowing that he has people supporting him and knowing, frankly, that his convictions are true and that his convictions are rooted in this really deep, brilliant intellect of his. So I think he'll do incredibly well in the confirmation hearings. I think everybody will see what Jen and I have seen up close, that he's just this incredibly thoughtful and caring person, and that'll shine through in the hearings. You know, when he gets on the bench, I think he's going to be really a shining star on the Supreme Court. It's an incredibly brilliant group of people, but what jumps out at me with Justice Kavanaugh, or future Justice Kavanaugh, hopefully, is that he has this remarkable ability to engage with people at their level and to persuade them. You know, I remember when I took a paper to Judge Kavanaugh, and I was pretty critical of a particular argument, and he came back to me and he said, you know what, you've got to be fair to the argument that you're trying to criticize. You've got to assume the best about the people that you're criticizing and he's the sort of person who's going to engage like that with his fellow justices, just like he does, you know, with a lowly law student.
Well, look, and Jennifer, I mean, that's a great point, because that's what our society is dealing with right now as well, of how we engage each other with people with whom we disagree. And yet here's a man who is being described by many as someone who really embodies that desire for fairness, which is what justice it really requires if we're going to genuinely have justice. Is that, especially for you as a professor, Is that kind of conversation still had in law schools? Is this something that young people are hearing about the importance of being fair, a civility in the arguments, or are we losing that generationally, do you think?
Well, I mean, I appreciate your question about collegiality, and I agree with JD that Judge Kavanaugh has that attribute in spades. You know, at law schools, you know, we're doing our best to try to teach to keep students in the tradition of thinking through issues and looking at both sides. I mean, I think in order to do that, of course, we want to have a diversity of perspectives in law school, a diversity of perspectives on the bench. And just one other point about Judge Kavanaugh and what JD was saying about his ability to persuade and think through the arguments. Right. I do anticipate if he were on the court that he continued to be a thought leader for decades to come. In 13 instances, the Supreme Court has already adopted positions that he's taken in his opinions on the lower court. Wow. He's collegial with all of his colleagues, and so I expect him to be a really persuasive voice if the Senate is to confirm him.
Yeah, obviously there's a variety of people in the Supreme Court now. A number of people are upset. But it seems that no matter who they are, whether it's Justice Ginsburg or Sotomayor or Roberts, that it's this kind of mind that can actually, when you're looking at things fairly, can bring these arguments together and help make the difference and get decisions that everyone, at least, I think, can relate to and appreciate. I mean, that's the kind of person we need for SCOTUS at this point.
I think that's exactly right, yes.
All right. Well, it's a brave thing to do. Thank goodness he's one of them. And thank you so much for giving us this perspective, both of you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. All right, now, a New York City councilman. We've just spoken about some dignity issues here, but he was arrested while protesting the nomination of Judge Kavanaugh. That councilman joins us next up.
Oh, hey, hey! Some nominee has got to go! Hey, hey!
All righty, as we saw at the top of the hour, the nomination of Judge Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court has left fired up New York City Councilman Jumaane Williams. He protested the nomination outside the Trump Tower last night and was actually arrested by New York police.
If we don't get it, 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 if we don't get it.
Councilman Williams was later released, which is always a good thing, and he joins us now. I really enjoyed, Jumaane, thanks for joining me tonight. Love the exchanges you have with Tucker, so it's a pleasure to meet you. I used to do protests like that. I've been arrested a couple times, and you know, it's kind of our work, right? But you know, a lot of the conversation has surrounded the nomination of Judge Kavanaugh. Agree that he's a smart man, a fair jurist, a nice guy. What exactly is your problem here with this nomination?
Well, it seems to me that there's a predominant ideology that's coming into the Supreme Court based on what everyone has said, what he himself has said, and what the president has said. And I think the Supreme Court should be a place where people can go and feel they're getting their grievances heard, not that there's a stacked deck of ideology that's going to harm them.
So if Hillary Clinton had won and she had nominated Eric Holder or Barack Obama for the Supreme Court, would that have been a stacked deck if there were more liberals than conservatives?
It also depends what we're talking about. If we're talking about stripping away fought,
well, just that basic question about ideology. Sure. Definitely liberalism versus conservatism. If Hillary had won, you know, she would appoint a liberal. So that's an ideology. That would have been the majority. Would that be a stacked deck?
So what I would say is this. I actually think it's good when some people have to be convinced, and so I think it's good when
it's imperative.
Where there's some balance. It seems to me that we are moving far away from that.
It's the arguments, right?
Absolutely.
The arguments.
And there are some people who can be, like Justice Kennedy, who can be convinced. I don't believe that Kavanaugh is that type of person, which I think even makes it more dangerous.
Is it possible you're wrong?
But also, I'm listening to what he himself has said and what the president has said that he wants to do with it. And so I'm listening to what they say their intentions are. Their intentions are very specifically to reverse Roe v. Wade. That is part of their intentions.
But that's incorrect. Already, Judge Kavanaugh said a number of years ago that he sees that as settled law, that he has no intention of confronting it or changing it. He takes precedent.
Very great examples of when the Supreme Court has gone back on precedent.
Yes, but you're arguing here about one in particular, and he has spoken on that one in particular case that is the Roe versus Wade. And now we'd have a different conversation if it was Amy Barrett that was nominated last night. This judge is not in that position. So we do have a statement about his attitude about that particular law. Now, look, I think...
No, he's also said, so there is the case, of course, with the immigrant undocumented who refused to have abortions. There is a case where he said that he thinks people should be able to discriminate against their employees based on reproductive decisions that they made. He has also said that he wants to get rid of a gun safety law. So we have a whole history of things.
And you're very, very good when we're talking about employees. We're talking Little Sisters of the Poor, the issue of religious freedom. But see, this is why, you know, you're a politician. I'm a critic. You know, we're not judges, right? There's a legal framework, and this, I think, for the Supreme Court's a very different dynamic, looking at the nature of what Americans expect within their individual freedom. And so, if you're talking about, expecting Little Sisters of the Poor to pay for abortions, that becomes a very different argument when it comes to religious freedom. And I think that's what we want judges to have those debates about. But within this, I think it's more. Would you agree? It's more of your distrust of President Trump and his decision-making than of Judge Kavanaugh.
But there's one thing I want to make sure we make it clear.
But you also haven't answered another question of mine, which is, could you be wrong about Judge Kavanaugh?
Let me just say something. I would pray to be wrong. But based on everything I've seen from this president, the Republicans, and the Democrats who have been too cowardice to push forward, and what this judge's history says, including saying you should be able to discriminate
you may be wrong,
against
and I
people.
appreciate that. And you do know, within any distrust of President Trump, which you've made very clear you don't like him, do you dismiss the nature of the impact, the positive impact economically on the African-American community when it comes to jobs and wages, lowest unemployment rate in history? Those are things I think that also matter to the community. I'm being asked to, I got to go. We could do this for an hour.
Sure.
Thank you so much for joining me, sir.
Activism gave us these rights, and activism will help protect them.
Well, I agree. We agree on that, absolutely. All right. Thank you, Councilman. Appreciate it. Tucker is back after the break. The war in Afghanistan has gone on for so long that soon people born after its beginning will be able to fight in it. Tucker's going to talk to a congressman about the future of America's longest war. Coming up next.
My message to Donald Trump and his team is that, you know, your views of Islam are ignorant.
You know, I don't think we should be rolling out the red carpet to the President of the USA in the circumstances where his policies go against everything we stand for.
The mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, no fan, obviously, of President Donald Trump, already stirring the pot ahead of the president's first visit as president to the United Kingdom this week, defending his decision to allow protesters there to fly this giant cartoon balloon depicting the president outside the British Parliament.
Did you personally approve this blimp of the President of the United States in a topless, in a nappy, to fly Parliament? Did you personally approve it?
No, but I support the GLA and the decision they took.
So is it your responsibility to approve that?
There are two issues.
Joining me now, Tom Rogan, Washington Examiner commentary writer and host of the McLaughlin Group. Tom, great to have you with us this morning. Obviously, Sadiq Khan has said all along that he doesn't think that the president should essentially even be allowed to visit the United Kingdom. He thought that should be discouraged, and now he's allowing this blimp to fly over the city during the visit. What do you think?
Well, good to be with you, Martha. I think the first thing to take away here is that Sadiq Khan, as a member of the Labour Party, has a vested interest in trying to delegitimate, to weaken Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, who is obviously a close ally of the President personally and professionally. But secondly, I think what you see here in terms of Sadiq Khan's sort of antics, if you will, is in some sense a deference to free speech. I personally think it's fine to have the balloon there. But more than that, an example of his leadership in the sense that this is not someone who is really a serious leader in terms of, you know, taking one of the world's greatest cities onto the world stage in a way that reflects it positively. Because the underpinning notion of, Sadiq Khan talks about values, but the underpinning notion of the American-UK special relationship is one of shared required sacrifice in war and peace, and for him to sort of suggest that that's peripheral and that, you know, to play these games, I think speaks much more to his character than it does to the president's.
Interesting. You know, I mean, obviously there's a long history of, you know, this sort of thing in the world of, you know, sort of pictures and, you know, ridiculous images of leaders when they visit. But this apparently required some sort of sanctioning from the mayor of London. And in the prior exchange, Piers Morgan asked him if he would have allowed it if there was a protest against President Obama. And he suggested that he would. You know, he said he if that's what the people wanted, he would have allowed it. I mean, I guess we can't really get inside his head, but I think conventional wisdom sort of suggests that that would be very unlikely.
I think you're correct. It would be very unlikely. I would even go so far as to say it would be, you know, near impossible for him to be seen doing that. But again, I think the ultimate point here is that actually the United States wins through the notion. Sadiq Khan, and I've written about this, has come out quite strongly in terms of saying that Twitter should ban what he regards as hate speech. Well, the American tradition of free speech, which in some way Trump triumphs from having the silly balloon flying across London, because it shows the United States, the world's most powerful nation, is willing to put up with that. But the broader point, though, I think, is that when it comes to the question of interest, investment in London, security in London, with the FBI and CIA liaison officers there who do an incredible amount of work to support the British counter-terrorism effort. No London mayor who seriously valued the service of his city or her city or the country would come out with these flippant lines against the president, because even if you didn't like the president, it would be undiplomatic and it wouldn't serve those interests, because the real tangible measure of those interests is defined by a closer relationship with the United States rather than a relationship built on adversarial
Excellent
contact.
Point. Excellent point. You know, you talked a moment ago about the friendship between the Prime Minister Theresa May and President Trump. And obviously there's a long-standing friendship between the leaders of these two countries. However, this morning on his way out the door, essentially, the president said, I like Boris Johnson. There's a chance I might meet with him. And Theresa May is under a lot of pressure right now, and she could potentially lose her prime ministership.
Well, I mean, that's true, but I think the president there was, you know, in terms of the transcript of the question, was responding to this challenge of, would you defer to British democracy in terms of, you know, whoever would be the leader of the Conservative Party or the Prime Minister? And I think he said that, but I think ultimately, you know, you saw the president say it is up to the British people, and I think this will be a constructive visit. And again, the tangibles of this visit, that's what I come down to, is that he has a major dinner at Churchill's birthplace, you know, house, and with major business leaders. That helps the US and UK economy, high value economies, right? So there's no loss of jobs in terms of, you know, what the president would say about NAFTA, but also there's that security arrangement, which is so critical. Today, the 100th anniversary of the Royal Air Force this year, F-35s flying over London. That's really American technology that helps British security. It also helps the United States.
Yeah. You make a great point. I mean, when all the noise is said and done and the blimps have flown, this is a very special relationship, and it's a mutual security compact that is essential to the future of the free world. Tom, we look forward to talking with you as we move forward this week. We'll be heading to London tonight to cover the president's visit, and look forward to you weighing in on that as well as we move forward this week. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Martha.
You bet.